with your introduction.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sheri Davis. I am the Associate Director for the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers University in the School of Management and Labor Relations. I'm co-director of a program called Will and Power, that's Women Innovating Labor Leadership. Been at Rutgers for 4 years. This is my 4th LERA, and I'm a critical race feminist by training. I also serve on the committee of the Advancing Black Strategists Initiative, and I'm board chair of the National Black Worker Center. I say all that to say that I do a whole lot of things that oftentimes is not necessarily doing research and writing and teaching, but these are also all my joys when I have the opportunity to do it. I am also really excited to be co-editor with the brilliant Naomi, Tammy, and Maite, who you will all hear from, on the upcoming LERA research volume 2022. And we are really excited to be able to talk to you all about that today. So I'm going to turn it over to Maite.
Thanks, Sheri. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining our session. So very briefly, my name is Maite Tapia. I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University. Tammy?
Wow, that was very brief, Maite.
I know, Maite.
Okay, I'm also co-editor of the LERA volume on industrial relations and racial reckoning, which we will talk about today. And Tammy and I also just got a paper out in the special issue in the ILR review, a special issue on employment relations on the lack of CRTI, essentially the lack of critical race theory in industrial relations. And it's been also wonderful for me to work together with Sheri, Tammy, and Naomi. Was that better?
Wow, you knocked that out of the park.
Thanks, everyone. That's great.
First and foremost, happy Pride, everyone. I'm Tammy Lee, assistant professor at Rutgers. As Maite said, she and I have a paper out on the lack of critical race theory in industrial relations, but it's one of several papers that she and I have been working together on. And hopefully later in this talk, we'll talk about our process and why we think that's important in terms of critical race theory and IR. I actually am not a critical race, I'm not trained in critical race theory. I'm not a race specialist. So those of you who've been saying that, please stop saying that. I am not a race expert. Critical race theory, I hope we're going to talk about, is something that is not a race expert thing. It's an approach to any social system in an oppressive system. So we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. The actual research that I do is on worker organizing on a macro level and worker participation in Cuba. So this is why I don't self-identify as a race expert, although I like to account for it in the things that we study. I also identify as a scholar activist. I am an industrial engineer by professional training and a lawyer by professional training. And I bring that into the space because all of that matters in terms of what we look at and how we approach issues of work. I kick it to Naomi.
Thank you, Tammy. Good morning, hello everyone. My name is Naomi R. Williams. I am an assistant professor in the Labor Studies Department at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations with Tammy and Sheri. I'm a historian of the US working class, and I focus on urban labor politics in the late 20th century. I'm also an oral historian, and in my work, I center the voices of working people in narrating their own histories. Like Tammy says, I'm not a historian of race, but I do think it's very important that race and racism and how it impacts institutions over time are all very important aspects to what I do, and I can't do what I do without doing that. And so Sheri is going to take us through some of the tenets of critical race theory and intersectionality before we kind of dive into Maite and Tammy's work. Sheri?
So one of the things I want to say first is that there are many tenets to critical race theory, but I'm going to speak to some of the ones that I feel like are more common and also are foundational. I will tell you that one of the reasons why I was drawn to CRT as an approach is because as a scholar, it gave me the opportunity to be able to use an approach without having to spend 75% of my paper convincing someone that racism exists, right? And so one of the first things that I think is important is CRT acknowledges that racism or sees racism as endemic and ingrained in American life. So there's no such thing as playing the race card or I'm just doing a race analysis or what have you, but there is a way in which we have to talk about the way that racism has structured the American life that we come to know and are used to, and that there's a response to it. And the response has to be race consciousness. Another tenet of CRT that I think is important to list, and again, one of the founders or major founder is Derek Bell. There's, you know, a plethora of books. I can't even begin to list all of them, from Faces at the Bottom of the Well to Confronting Authority. But a key text spoke specifically about Brown versus Board of Education and something called the interest convergence dilemma, right? So understanding that there are times when we do see progress. And this, I feel like, is one of those moments where people are talking about, you know, all the possibilities and there's movement and there's progress. But the question is, whose interests are converging in this moment? And how are we going to move forward in a way that actually is responsive to the issues that have been raised by those who are most oppressed and most marginalized, versus moving forward in a way that responds to the interests of those who are elite and already shaping. And so this is one of the, I would say, tenets that was named by Derek Bell. And the response is to put the situations that we are looking at right now within a historical and a political context, that it is quite necessary that we not only are challenging dominant narratives that are there, but that we are doing it by putting these narratives in a historical and a political context. And so another tenet that I want to raise, and this one is very interesting to me, because this challenging of dominant narratives, or recognizing that there are official stories or myths that we operate on. Looking at those critically and actually, again, responding to that using storytelling and counter narrative. And so that means that there's, when in fact we have a narrative around, say, for instance, Brown versus Board of Education being about integration and progress and moving forward, what in that instance happened is that the voices of Black parents, the voices of Black teachers, the voices of Black administrators who were dissenting voices were silenced. And they were silenced very specifically because this was a moment where you saw interest convergence, and those narratives did not help to move things forward. But the call or the recognition for, you know, not attending to the issues that Black students, Black parents, Black families, Black communities were raising, by not responding to that, we saw 50 years later that the schools were just as segregated, and that in many cases, students were in worse off positions. And so being able to actually lift up those stories, those narratives that are typically silenced, being able to attend to oppositional voice. And so I'm going to raise the name of Mari Matsuda and the importance of looking to the bottom, and the importance of oppositional voice, not necessarily just as a story to be fit into an already formed dominant narrative, but to be able to speak to the experiences of and the conditions that those who are marginalized are facing, and to name the kinds of repairs that would address these issues. I also would say that attending to or confronting colorblindness and the myth of meritocracy is a major tenet of critical race theory. And a response to that has been Cheryl Harris's whiteness as property. And so being able, again, to put these situations or the ways that we talk about it into a historical and a political context, such that we understand that there is a way in which whiteness has a tangible property to it, as in the ultimate right to exclude, as in the right to own property. And that was both initially in terms of land, but also in terms of the labor of enslaved Africans. That when we start to look at the shaping of how we understand property and how we understand whiteness, then we can understand the currency that it continues to hold and to be able to interrogate that. And lastly, I want to speak to really the tenet that brought me in and that I learned through Black feminist scholarship, which is intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw's seminal text, Demarginalizing the Intersections. And I will put some of the links into the chat so that you can see some of these things as we go along. But Kimberly Crenshaw really brought forward this term intersectionality and forced us to actually think about this. It originated in a workplace, like it was a workplace issue. And so this is one of the reasons why I have argued that critical race theory and labor has already been connected for more than 30 years, in that being able to name the particular problem of what was happening for Black women as it related to employment, being able to identify why they were excluded from the remedies of anti-discrimination law, and the ways that naming it allows you to be able to seek remedies to address these issues. And so she developed an opportunity for us to think about a praxis that is not just about how we do inquiry, but the fact that that inquiry has to lead to action-oriented or some kind of response where we try to change the systems. And so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say again, racism as endemic in American life, interest convergence, the importance of counter-narrative, the importance of oppositional voice, whiteness as property, and intersectionality are really great places to start. And I want to actually kick it over to Tammy and Maite in terms of really illuminating the way that intersectionality and critical race theory as an approach kind of can function within industrial relations.
Maite, you wanna start?
Is this saying, go ahead, Tammy?
Oh, okay. So we were sort of asked by the people who put together, I guess that's ourselves, to sort of explain our personal journeys and connections to CRTI. I will say that Maite and I started writing together. I came on as a second author on a paper that she was doing that was an empirical study of Fight for 15 and Rock, New York, right? And so the language, most of, at least for me, Maite and I being interested in this came from observing organizing that was happening, and the fact that organizers, community and labor organizers, were using the language of critical race theory. And we had no way to sort of explain it in our literature, right? Like we still have all of these sort of frameworks for worker organizing, which did not actually interact with existing theory. And when we talk about critical race theory, we're talking about a set of theories and an approach to studying social systems that's been around for over 3 decades, right? And so we were finding, and then after we studied Fight for 15 and Rock, New York, we moved on to a study that we're working on now, which was of the Women's March. It was almost impossible for us to even describe to audiences of labor scholars that these movements were in fact labor movements and that they were important to labor studies. It was wild. It was like, how does Women's March relate to worker organizing? And we're like, they have an entire platform that has to do with workers, and we're not seeing them. We're not seeing those movements as labor movements. And we thought that that was just so wild. And then we realized, like, there really is no discussion of mobilization and alternatives to it where we could talk to a traditional union type audience from the same theoretical position that the activists were using, right? I also was introduced for the first time to critical race theory also through Kimberly Crenshaw. Because I'm a lawyer by training, I had read some pieces by Kimberly Crenshaw about how the law is a tool for injustice, right? That's how we codify these erasures into our society. And I've always been interested in this idea that it's just so weird that even in the US, even our anti-discrimination law is colorblind. How? What is the purpose of that? Why is that still happening? Why, when we talk about racial equity or gender equity, we just can't go so far as to get to the root of it? And I think that for me, critical race theory was about getting to the root of injustice. And I guess I will, before I turn it over to Maite, just tell a very personal story about the other thing that attracted me to critical race theory, which is the whitewashing of the labor movement that exists in our canon of research. And when I say whitewashing, I'm not actually calling everybody racist. I'm just saying that if you turn and open some of our core theory courses and syllabi, you would get the impression that unions were always for civil rights. The UAW was a leader and all these things. And while that might be part of the story, it just didn't fit with like my grandfather, who was part of the second migration from Memphis, headed to Chicago and ends up working at the Studebaker factory in South Bend, Indiana. He had to cross a picket line to integrate not only auto manufacturing in Indiana, but also to integrate the UAW. This was not at all a story that I found in any of the literature that I had been given in 5 degrees in labor relations, including a PhD, right? And then I'm TAing a course where the UAW comes to speak, and there's no discussion of where were the unions, what was happening at the local level during the civil rights period or during Jim Crow. And so I didn't see myself or my community reflected in the very research that I was reading and building my theoretical base in. And that's always sort of sat with me and made me uncomfortable about how we're explaining the issues that are faced by working people and what we mean by the working class, right? When we don't also talk about social identity. So that's my personal story. I'm happy to sort of debate people about that. But I'm gonna turn it over to Maite to sort of talk about the development of our paper maybe.
Great, thank you, Tammy. And I just see that there's a question in the chat by Mary Grace. So she's asking, what were some of the things that you were hearing activists or organizers on the ground saying that signaled that they were using critical race theory? What stories and narratives were you hearing? Some of the people we talked about, organizers, also used the word intersectional when we talked about their organizing, and just it was very clear that they were linking issues of economics to also housing, police brutality, healthcare, etc. So constantly making those links between issues of class, race, gender, and also in their demands and how they talked about it was very clear to us that they took on a much more intersectional approach. Just very briefly in terms of my story, I actually learned first about intersectionality, which of course is quite big in, for example, sociology or feminist studies. And I did that work with Jane Holgate and Gabriele Alberti. But afterwards, I kind of realized that we took it as a standalone concept, and sometimes that's still done, but without thinking about the roots, as Sheri and Tammy just mentioned, like where does intersectionality come from? And that you sometimes see that, especially maybe perhaps by white feminists, that we think about intersectionality, but it's somehow cut off from critical race theory. And so it was only by working together with Tammy that I learned a lot about CRT. I read some of the books that Sheri mentioned, and was quite eye-opening and very important to me. So as Tammy mentioned, we've done a lot of this research in coalition together by kind of forming this diverse team. Because as Mari Matsuda also mentioned, you can do it secondhand. Like for me, this would be if some of the stuff is secondhand, but then it's best that you do it together. And so for me, doing this with Tammy has been critical in how to, you know, approach this, analyze the phenomenon through a CRT lens. So that's just very briefly in terms of background. And then in terms of our paper, I would just say that what we essentially argue or say essentially is that within industrial relations studies, the way we were taught, it has kind of this long existing white dominance in theories of organizing and employment relations. And so essentially in our field, like the questions we ask, the theory we build, the research we publish, or the manner in which we explain kind of labor and employment phenomena, it's often conducted through kind of a wide or a privileged group narrative. So therefore, we argue it's very important to take into account CRTI to address kind of that erasure of these vital counter narratives, as Sheri mentioned. And that allows us then also to expand our cases for labor and employment research that goes beyond the workplace. Because often in our field, when we do talk about conditions of marginalized workers, it's often within kind of these specialized occasions, even though despite the fact that, of course, we know that inequity permeates or is at work in every system that we study. So for us, what we say in the paper is that essentially CRTI would allow us to critically assess what does success look like, what does justice look like, or success and justice for whom, what does worker voice look like, who are the workers, etc. So and that's then we then also build on kind of our paper and on other people's work and we together, the four of us, have kind of come up with this proposal for this LERA volume, in which we are bringing together academics, practitioners, artists, and talk about this kind of racial reckoning within broadly kind of labor studies, labor activism, or kind of labor arts, essentially. And so we have built this really amazing cohort, and it's not just that everyone is on their own, just like doing this chapter and then we just put it together in a volume. No, I think what we've done is we've been creating a cohort and learning from each other, and really also across, you know, the fields that we are. Some are in geography and IR, more labor history. And so that's been really eye-opening. Some are doing really the work on the ground. And so we've been meeting every month, talking about our work, writing together, etc. So I'm really excited about what we're gonna hopefully deliver within 1 year in this volume. And I hope it will be kind of, in a way, I mean, maybe revolutionary and groundbreaking, and really starting to think about this racial reckoning within our field of IR. Thanks.
Yeah, I just will add just a little bit to everything Maite said, which I think is absolutely right. One of the other implications of both the volume and our paper that was in the special issue is that we think it is necessary, I hate to use the word critical again and again and again, for us to be familiar with critical race theory and trying to figure out what is going on in contemporary movements in this society. There's no way you can understand what Black Lives Matter has to do with labor justice if you don't have a set of theories or an approach that could help you appreciate why it matters that these movements are being led by women and people of color, and what it is that they're seeking in terms of how we do research into what the policy should be, all of these things. And so we were just, at the moment we were writing that paper, living through a time in which we felt like the discussions and the panels we were being pulled to talk on completely missed, right, this whole important conversation about what those movements are about and what social justice means in the labor world if you're not white, right? So we talk about labor movements all the time. If you're a Black worker, that is totally integrated with civil rights, right? So some of the things you're seeing people do and calling new is not in fact new, depending on the lens that you use to understand it. And so we were living through that in real time with Women's March and Black Lives Matter. And we just think that, you know, this set of theories would be really helpful in the IR context for understanding what we mean by labor justice and how that equates with social justice.
Yeah, thanks for that. And, you know, not doing that, right? Not doing what Tammy is saying and not doing what Tammy and Maite are calling for in their paper is actually harmful. And, you know, we're trying to correct harms, and we can't do that if we're not asking even the right questions and we don't know what questions to ask. I want to talk a little bit about my own personal journey, right? So I'm a labor historian, and as a labor historian coming into the field of industrial relations, I'm often looking for the broader historical context, both in approaches to research questions and in findings and implications. And, you know, it's constructive to compare the origin stories, if you will, of industrial relations and labor history, because there is a joint origin story. We both fields point to the same starting point, and there is a divergence late in the 20th century, in the 80s and the 90s. And I think that part of the reason for that divergence and what that looks like is labor historians dealing with critical race theory and intersectionality. And the path that we took as a field, right? So this is before my time, but I'm going to use we here. The path we took, I think, is really constructive to industrial relations scholars. And so that's what my piece in the volume is going to be about in particular, is looking at this narrative history of the two fields and how labor history diverges from industrial relations. I think Maite and Tammy are correct, right? Without critically interrogating race and racism in our research, we limit the effectiveness and the goal, right? The goal of our research should be making the world a better place for working people. That should be the main focus of what we're doing. And I think that the social history of the 1960s, right? What people were calling the new social history back in the day, from the bottom up, was really a start of this subfield of labor history that has shaped who I am as a scholar. And in the 1980s, and so this is 1960s, 1970s, in the 1980s and the 1990s, you had scholars like Earl Lewis calling on all historians, right, to integrate race and theorize race and racism in their historical narratives. You had Dave Roediger, Jim Barrett, and the amazing and wonderful scholar Tara Hunter, all of them, and scholars like them, right, who, and people also who doing this work within the field of sexuality, right? They've pushed labor historians to interrogate the ways that race-based inequalities are shaped and reshaped by histories of struggle and by efforts to maintain white supremacy. For example, right, in her 1990 New Left Review article, Barbara Jean Fields puts that call to action in place, right, when she historicizes race, the ideology of race, and how that played out from the 1660s in Virginia through the Revolutionary period, the Declaration of Independence, and the forming of the new nation. And in that history, you come up with this idea of race that gets embedded into the legal structures of the United States. And she also successfully argued for scholars to pay attention to how societies recreate and make new meanings of race over time. And the labor historians and the scholars who do that work that have shaped my intellectual growth all have this in common. And it's an urgent desire to find better ways to understand and better ways to act for justice. So what drew me to study working class history is the same thing that Tammy said about her personal story, right? Is the fact that, you know, I'm in all of these doing all this coursework, reading all of this US history, and I don't see reflected my lived experience. It's not there. My experience, my family, my community, none of that is in the history until I took a class on oral history methodology and labor history in the South. And that's when I said, okay, this is the work that I want to do as a scholar. And it's really what shaped me. And so that new social history, which labor history was a subfield of, and oral history, highlighted the ways workers themselves, right, were using racial analyses to interpret their past experiences. And so what CRT and intersectionality can do is provide a framework to allow workers to tell their own stories. And then as researchers and scholars, we can integrate those narratives, and it helps us ask better questions about what we are doing. You know, I think I'll give you one example of probably the best example in the last 20 years, except for a new book that just came out that I'll talk about later if we have time. It's Annalise Orlick, right? Fighting Caesar's Palace. What that book does, it integrates life history with trade union activism and a broad social history of the neighborhood of West Las Vegas. And she uses that to tell the story of the Federal War on Poverty program. And her subtitle to that book really makes this point very clear. The subtitle is How Black Mothers Fought Their Own War on Poverty. So here you have Black women workers who are in, you know, the food service industry, working inside hotels and casinos in Las Vegas. And they use their union activism to empower themselves to become politically involved. And then they push for all of these programs when they realize that their neighborhood is being underserved. And they bring in a library, dental, healthcare, childcare, all of these other things, and they become leaders in the welfare rights organizations. And it's not told as a, these are victims. It's not about, you know, oh, Black women in poverty. Yes, right? Their wages are not enough to live a middle-class lifestyle, but they're union members, they're active in their unions. And because they also qualify for welfare, they're active in the welfare rights organizations. And telling that narrative that way gives opportunities, right? We can use it. It's a usable path. We offer solutions to policymakers, right? These are clear-cut steps that you can take from the voices of people who know what they need, who know what their neighborhoods are missing. And it's also motivating to workers themselves because they see their experiences played out on the page. They see how the power of collective action with other working people, and that brings them together. Right. And so to me, this is the kind of work that we need to be doing and that we should be doing. And it's the importance of critical race theory and intersectionality. It offers more nuanced policy proposals, and it mobilizes workers for broad-based social justice movements. Because for me, the ultimate question is, why are so many white workers unwilling to join these worker movements that are happening right now today? And the answer is because they are not exposed to critical race theory. And if they were, then they would be more willing to understand racialized capitalism and how that pays out in the 21st century.
So I want to just say that I have the privilege of having spent my entire career kind of with a Black feminist pathway laid out, which didn't necessarily have destinations, which was challenging. But I will tell you, I was trained under Dr. Beverly Guy-Shefdahl out of Spelman College. It's the only comparative women's studies program at a historically Black college and university. I learned about intersectionality as a senior. I learned about looking to the bottom and Mari Matsuda as a senior in college. And my entire pathway has been shaped by that. I left Spelman and I studied in South Africa, I worked in South Africa with the Violence Against Women's organization, where I was able to apply the things that I learned in school When I came back, I was at Rutgers at the Center for Women's Global Leadership. I learned even further the way that these concepts not only applied in the States, but beyond. And from there, I actually went to Ohio State University to get a master's in women's studies. And we had a major strike on campus, CWA, I think it's 4501, I believe, out of Columbus, Ohio. And what I saw actually is that the president of the local came to a Black student union meeting that I attended. He told us the story of what was happening with workers having not gotten real significant increases, even though they'd been there for 20 plus years. That people who were starting at McDonald's were making more money once you address the insurance and the parking fees that the university was leveraging every time the union was able to secure a raise, and that the workers were ready to strike. And he came to secure the support of the Black Student Union, and we proceeded to shut down Ohio State's campus. We took over the president's office for 30 days. And for me, what happened is the first day I was out there and I saw the women who were food service workers, I saw my grandmother in them. They were raising their grandchildren off of this salary or off of these wages, to be clear. They had had a union for at least 2 decades. Ohio State was the main employer in Columbus, Ohio. And I was really clear that there was a hierarchy. So the white males were in maintenance, the Black and Latino males were in landscaping, and the Black women were in food service and housekeeping. And so it was literally laid out, not only in terms of the way that they were classified, but also in the contract. And so clearly those in maintenance were making more money and had more power. And those in food service and housekeeping made less money and had less power and protections. And so for me, this was an opportunity to put my Black feminist principles into action. That's how I come to labor. Not, my father is UAW. I know I went to college. I had health insurance. We took vacations, all of that, but I knew nothing about the union. And quite frankly, my dad had a coveted job in Atlanta, Georgia, because there are very few unions. When I was growing up, people didn't talk about unions. I only knew that my father was connected to UAW, but that didn't become real until I was on a picket line at Ohio State University. And he's calling over and over again to say, be careful what's going on, because I didn't even see it as a threat or risky. I just saw it as, this is the way that you show up when you put your theory into practice. And so my journey in labor has always been shaped not only by Black feminist theory, but by critical race theory, but specifically intersectionality, because intersectionality offers not only a way of thinking, but a way of being in the work. I have always been a scholar activist. And so from Ohio State, I left there. I went to work in labor at the AFL-CIO in the field mobilization department. I then went to work at SEIU in the Justice for Janitors campaign. I understood the tensions between Black and brown workers because I had an assessment of what was going on and how people were coming into this local with very different histories, with very different contexts. And so what I knew was important is that I sit down and understand what these contexts were, that I hear these stories, understand the context within which they are understanding what's going on, identify the problems with them, identify the remedies with them, because I respected their oppositional voice to the employers that they were dealing with, including to the way that the union was functioning and shaped. And so, the reason why I have been, I will say it's very challenging because I went back to the South to get my PhD and still had supportive scholars who kind of baked me. I had all of this information about CRT, but I didn't know the terminology until I took a critical race theory and urban education class. And it was like whatever was left blurry became clear. I had the language I needed to be able to speak as the scholar that I was, not the scholar that someone was trying to fit me into. Like there's boxes where people want you to be. I could be interdisciplinarity because to me, if you're trying to solve a problem, you will choose and use every discipline available to you to both understand it and to try to come up with what the remedies are that you are seeking. And you will do that in community. When I did my dissertation, I had one foot in with my professors, but I also kept a foot out with my community folks, working not only with environmental justice organizations, health justice organizations, and education justice organizations in the community. And all of them show up in my dissertation, and all of them showed up at my defense. And I say all this because there is a difference when you are actually bringing not only the voices of the people who teach you, so I can listen to what my grandmother taught me as a domestic worker in Atlanta, Georgia in the early 1900s. I can bring that forward and say her name, as opposed to having to talk about Michel Foucault, who, quite frankly, if you go to the roots of it, a lot of his work is rooted in Black Panther Party, right? So if I can bring those people in the room and to the table with me, and I can acknowledge the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Ella Bakers who are shaping the theoretical frameworks that I'm working with, in addition to the people that they are shaped by. And I have a very clear understanding that my project is not necessarily to impress the people who are around me, but that my project is to lift up the very communities that I come out of. Then under those circumstances, critical race theory gave me the platform to be able to not only just speak with confidence about what I was talking about, because I knew the historical context and I knew the political context that created the conditions, but it also meant that I had work to do, and that my job, again, was to continue to do this work. So we are moving towards worker liberation, and we're dismantling these systems and structures with an eye towards transformation all the time. And so for me, critical race theory, again, has been part and parcel of me understanding and seeing who I am and becoming as a scholar activist. But all of that comes back to the roots of Black feminist theory and Black feminist scholarship. So I'll start there.
Should we maybe open it up, given the time constraints?
I think so, Maite, yes. Erin, you had a question. Do you want to ask it out loud?
Oh, sure. I just, yeah, I appreciate you guys thinking about putting stories forward and wondering if you imagine or even seen, I haven't been in a college or grad school classroom in a very long time, but our videos or other forms of communication where you can get those stories out part of classroom now? And is that, or if not, how might we make those stories more accessible in ways beyond just books and articles?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, co-editors, I'm just going to jump right in since I read Erin's question earlier. I think that outside of books and articles is most important for worker engagement and worker mobilization. Part of what I do as an oral historian is ask people to tell their life histories, and then workers amongst themselves can get together, right, and organize them in such a way that they can use it. Here I'm using the same word again. They can use it as an organizing tool within their workplaces and within their communities. And so the effort of gathering the stories and curating them and putting them together to come up with some sort of joint analysis is part of that organizing work. And that's something that workers do all the time in all sorts of research projects. And if you bring your research ideas, right, to workers in such a way that they have input in the questions that you ask, right, then they see themselves as subjects, right? They are participants in the research and they're not objects of study. And I think that that's really important. One of the things that I'm trying to do here at Rutgers is build a New Jersey workers oral history program to collect these stories and to make them visible. I am talking with Unite Here, the union, to for next year, or actually 2022, I guess that is next year, right? 2022, to have a conference on how workers can use their own stories of the work that they did in the 2020 election and what that looks like. So that's just a couple of the ways that that can be done outside of scholarly sources.
Yeah, Erin, I think, there's things that we can learn about critical race theory that can inform our pedagogy, whether or not we're labor educators or in a research university. One of those things is having your students go through and gather storytelling. I still do a lot of Studs Terkel. So I'm from Chicago. I have a lot of Studs Terkel stuff on there, getting the students to go out and collect oral histories and then engage with the stuff that's on the syllabus that's, core to IR. I also just wanted to note, as sort of a tangent to Erin's question, one of the approaches that we had to this volume, the LERA volume for next year, is that we wanted to make sure we didn't assemble just scholars. So we are doing these sort of conversations about critical sort of analysis of labor and employment through the lens of artists and activists and conversations with folks who are not academics. That is to sort of force us all, the readers of a LERA volume, because who's reading that? That's, that's us, to sort of deal with alternative ways, alternative expertise, even lived experience, and how that informs the kind of research that we do. So we really hope that that catches on and that you all appreciate that in the volume.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I recently taught a course, co-taught a course with Dr. Danielle T. Phillips Cunningham from Texas Women's University, but we taught a virtual course at Spelman called COVID-19 and Black Workers, Race, Gender, and Labor. And we brought in, leaders of unions. We brought in, geographers, right? Labor geographers. We brought in, policymakers who gave us an hour almost every class of what it looks like to actually to bring an intersectional racial formation like framework to the work, right? So this is something, if you haven't read Putting Their Hands on Race by Dr. Danielle T. Phillips Cunningham, who is one of the contributors also to this volume, I highly recommend it. But what we ask our students to do actually is to use counter narrative to identify an essential worker in their family or even a fictional essential worker, and to study, where do they live? How much are they making? What kind of insurance do they have access to or don't they? Do they have to subsidize or get access to public subsidy in order to take care of things? How many dependents do they have? And really shape what it means, like what that profile looked like, and to bring that worker with them to class. And so they might not have had these particular experiences, but looking through the lens of their mom, who's a teacher or a nurse or in the military, or you name it, when we had a range of different essential workers who were Black women that they brought into the space. And so that meant that we were asking a number of different questions, and they were primed to be in the position to ask different kinds of questions. And so I one of the things we didn't really get into deeply, and will, probably address later, is, and I'm just going to say, please don't post Amazon. We ain't buying books from Amazon. Buy it from Rutgers University Press. So sorry, Danielle's book is Rutgers University Press. But the point is that the way we do our pedagogy matters, right? We can do pedagogy in a way that invites people into the conversation, or we can do pedagogy in such a way that it lets them know that this is not for you. And so to me, for me, I talk about a critical race feminist praxis, that there is a way of being not only in your research, but also in your teaching, it's in your writing. So the politics of citation, if you go through your what you have written in the past, and less than 5% of who you cite are people of color, are women of color, then there's an issue, because that means that you are not engaging with folks who don't look like you. And I think this is something that I said a couple of years ago at LERA on the diversity panel that we had for the luncheon. But the politics of citation is real, and it has an impact on whether or not we are able to attract more people, more diverse folk into these spaces, whether we're signaling to Black and brown folks that this is a place for you. And quite frankly, in this volume, one of the things that we've been doing is looking at all of the people of color that we see who are doing labor studies everywhere else but here. Literally everywhere else but here. They're doing labor, but they're not doing it here. And that to me means that there is a critical question that has to be asked. And quite frankly, we're using the volume to invite them, please be here, bring this scholarship here. And then the question is, what do we do moving forward, right? Like, so do we say there's a place for you here, or do people continue to feel like this work has to be done in places that center race, or places that center gender, or places that actually have a broader analysis or a more engagement with critical race theory and intersectionality theories?
And I think also within our courses that, for example, Tammy and I had at Cornell, what we start off reading within kind of the classic IR theory, it's all about commons and webs and Marx and Montgomery, etc. And so what happens is that race is then always—
Not that much Marx, Maite, not that much Marx, let's be honest.
So, but in essence, race remains kind of subsidiary to class identity, instead of kind of like Hill, a historian, has said, kind of instead of understanding the historical development essentially of the working class of the working class identity as a racial identity. And so essentially what Tammy and I, again, also in the paper, are saying that we're kind of gatekeepers of knowledge production. So we really, as scholars, we affect kind of future scholarship, but also we affect kind of real life phenomena and the power structures in a way. And so CRT therefore really kind of reflects a theoretical commitment to kind of social justice in knowledge production.
Yeah. And just so we can be completely honest and frank about this, one of the things that happens to me, having the opposite theoretical development of Sheri, where I've been trained in mostly exclusively predominantly white institutions, and I haven't had any sort of mentors who have introduced me to gender studies or ethnic studies or race studies. What happens when I get called as a PhD to be on a panel in front of an audience that's diverse is that I have to figure this out. I have to figure out critical race theory in order to respond to the people in a way in which they would expect me to as a Black queer feminist, right? So that means that I am constantly always looking at our body of literature in industrial relations and making those connections for an audience, right, who would expect that to come from me. So I feel like I've been really blessed to have run into critical race theory because it has made just my existence in academia make much more sense as an educator, as a Black worker, as a queer worker, all the things that are happening to me and happening to the people who are asking for my public intellectualism make more sense. Because it just honestly doesn't make sense that all of our working scholarship doesn't do a lot of centering of social identity when we all are workers and we know that those things are so important, right? And so it's really just acknowledging what's already in the room and in the community and in the space. And if we don't reflect that back, we're gonna lose a whole group of potential scholars, a whole group of potential labor leaders, because they don't see themselves in the work that we're doing, and they're going outside of our conferences, outside of our body of work to find answers to what is going on with them. And I really think that we have a great opportunity, because we're inherently multidisciplinary, to sort of bring this in, right? At least engage in it, right? So that when you are out and you're in an audience and you're talking about racial inequality or wealth inequality, that you've actually engaged with folks who have been studying this with a critical lens for a very long time. The last thing I want to say, and I know we're running out of time, is that occasionally we hear things, and I know that Maite and I talk about this a lot. Like, we were at a conference and someone sort of mentioned that, you know, they were over intersectionality, or like, oh, just so tired of hearing about it, and critical race theory. And when you do that, what you do is erase 3 decades of work by Black feminist scholars and other scholars who have been doing all the questions you have about methodology and the other, you know, critiques of this set of theories. People have been working on that for a very long time. We literally have to just go to the library and read it, right? And so I really want us to push back against this whole anti-CRTI or being exhausted with it, because that is to our own detriment as a field.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tammy. You know, Sheri and I have a piece in the 2021 LERA research volume, and I just want to, you know, say thank you, Sheri, right, for helping me. I'm coming from labor history where this stuff is so embedded, we don't even actually talk about it as something upfront. We just do it in our work, right? And so adding that framework, you know, I have a series of counter narratives of worker mobilization and what that looks like from the 1940s, you know, through the 21st century. And, you know, Sheri really provided that framework for me. And that's the kind of collaborative work we're doing with this research, the 2022 volume, and, you know, being a studies field and what it looks like to sit down with geographers and lawyers and sociologists and just really have these conversations and work through it together as scholars, as practitioners, and as activists. So, you know, thanks y'all for doing this.
Can I say one last thing that I think is really important? I taught a class called CRT and Labor recently, really short kind of intercession course. Had worker leaders, presidents of locals, you know, folks who've been long time in the labor movement. And the thing that I thought was really interesting, so half the class, just a little over half the class were white students. I got my evaluations back. And what they said was, Whiteness as Property was literally one of the most helpful texts that I have read. It was long and you know, like labor scholarship for folks is like long and dense, great. You know, all the reading in the footnotes. But they said, this is something I can hold on to, right? Like, this understanding of the way that whiteness is constructed is something that I can work with in ways that many of the inclusion and diversity and whatever, and my, you know, DEI for me has always been marketing, because I was there at Ohio State when we were trying to support Michigan State with holding on to affirmative action. DEI, or diversity, has been a response to affirmative action with no teeth, with no enforcement, with no regulation or nothing around that. So as far as I'm concerned, it's PR and PR only, sometimes done well, oftentimes not. But it requires you to engage the issue of exclusion, that there's a system that was constructed to exclude. And so starting from this place of, in this moment, I don't want to think about the ways that we constructed a system to exclude. I only want to focus on inclusion moving forward. Audre Lorde, right behind me, has always said that basically the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. So this idea of trying to come into a house that was not built for you does not make sense. And so being able to stand back and get people to look at the structure and say, are there doors for women, people of color, marginalized folks to be able to come through and live in this house? If there are not, then we must construct a different house, right? One that we are all meant to live in. And so quite frankly, a pathway of transformation, like, that has to be a commitment that everyone is making. And you can't make that commitment if you're not willing to see the problems with the current house. And this is basically the thing that we're calling for. let's get in this together so that we can have a real conversation about the materials and the tools that were used and so on and so forth, and really get about the business of constructing the multiracial democracy that we say we want to live in, that we say we want to have, where people have the ability to govern themselves, that they have the ability to speak about the conditions of their lives and have people listen to them and not be in a place of powerlessness. And so for me, we can get into the fine details of this, but at the heart of it, at the root of it, the question is, do we want to actually live together, or do we want to maintain a system where it is wholly considered okay for white folks to live in neighborhoods that have sidewalks and have better schools and have access to all the grocery stores and have access to, right, peace and quiet and parks and whatever the case may be, while other folks are tripping, right, trying to walk up the street to get to the bus. And I mean, sometimes I read, the reason why I rock with CRT in terms of storytelling is because you cannot understand that reading a bunch of theory, quite frankly. You need to hear that with all the heart and the humanity that goes along with it.
That was a great way to close us out. Thank you, Sheri.
I think also it goes back to, Sheri, when you were speaking prior to this, when I said, you better preach, because it was like a Monday sermon, is also the aspect of how even in traditional labor, how stories have in pedagogy and theory and practice all taken from workers. And we seem to forget that in comment in now in academic spaces. And oftentimes those workers were Black and brown and other marginalized people. And then we take it and we homogenize the story and make it labors, which means make it white, and then want to move that forward. And so to connect all of that and why it's so important to then be able to move these things forward, I think is really key. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to the talk, our roundtable.
Yeah, I think we're out of time, but Aaron put a link to us being at LRAN. So we hope to have some of our contributors to the volume also at that conference. So a plug for LRAN, our sister conference.
Yeah, Carrie Fresh, our geographer, is going to be at the LRAN panel. Very exciting. See y'all at 12:30.
Thank you all.